Part 1. The Woman Left Behind. The white dress was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the woman wearing it, not her age, not the careful way she carried herself across the uneven cobblestones of Millhaven's town square, not the worn leather bag clutched against her side like it contained something worth protecting. People noticed the dress first. They always noticed the dress. It was ivory, not quite white, the color of old silk that has been folded and unfolded too many times. The cut was elegant in a way that felt displaced, like something from a different era, entirely a different life. The woman wearing it moved slowly but without hesitation, threading through clusters of Sunday morning churchgoers who stepped aside without fully understanding why. Something in her posture communicated intent. Something in her eyes made people move. She was 75 years old. Her white hair was pinned carefully at the nape of her neck. Her hands, visible as she walked, were the hands of someone who had worked with them for decades, the knuckles slightly swollen, the fingers still precise and deliberate in their movement. She was not a large woman, she was not loud, but every person in that square turned to look, and once they looked, they could not seem to look away. She walked directly toward the center of the square, toward the largest gathering of people, toward a white-haired man of 78 who stood at the middle of everything holding a coffee cup, smiling the smile he had been perfecting for 50 years. She stopped 4 feet away from him. He looked up. For one fraction of a second, before his careful smile reassembled itself, something crossed Gerald Harmon's face that looked very much like fear. Then the woman reached into her bag and the square went very quiet. That was Sunday morning in Millhaven, Georgia. This story begins 4 days earlier. Dorothy Mae Calloway had lived in the yellow house on Sycamore Street for 23 years. Not owned, rented. There was a distinction, and Dorothy understood it with the particular clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime on the wrong side of it. She had rented from Clarence Odell, a widower in his 80s, who had inherited the house from his parents and had never quite gotten around to doing anything ambitious with it. Clarence had been a quiet, decent man who believed that a person's word meant something. He had told Dorothy she could stay as long as she needed. He had said it the way people say things they mean. He had never put it in writing. For 23 years, Dorothy paid her rent in cash on the first of every month, slipping the envelope through the brass mail slot in Clarence's door 3 blocks away. For 23 years, she kept the yellow house in better condition than it had been when she arrived, patching the garden fence herself, repainting the kitchen when the old paint began to peel, replacing the cracked bathroom tiles with money she had earned from alterations, work spread across the dining room table. She had made the house into something, not grand, but cared for, tended, the kind of home that tells you something about the person living inside it. Clarence Odell died peacefully in his sleep on a Wednesday in February, 91 years old, which was a good long life by any measure. His daughter flew in from Sacramento for the funeral, stayed 4 days, and then listed the property with a developer who specialized in residential teardowns. Dorothy received a formal notice of eviction 38 days later. She had no lease. She had no legal standing. She had 23 years of faithfully paid rent and a dead man's word, and neither of those things had weight in a Georgia courtroom. She had understood this from the moment she read the notice sitting at the kitchen table, where she had taken in alterations work for 2 decades, her reading glasses pushed up on her nose, her coffee going cold beside her. She had understood it. That did not make it any less devastating. She called Russell first because Russell was the oldest, and because Russell was a lawyer, and because some stubborn maternal instinct kept insisting that the boy she had raised would find a way to help her. Russell was 50 years old. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and a corner office in a firm that handled corporate real estate, which meant he understood exactly how little legal ground Dorothy stood on before she finished explaining the situation. He was not unkind about it exactly. Unkindness requires a certain engagement with the other person's pain. Russell delivered the facts with the flat, businesslike tone he used with difficult clients. There was no lease. There were no tenant protections applicable to her situation. The new owner had followed proper procedures. Dorothy would need to vacate within 60 days. When Dorothy pointed out that 60 days was not enough time for a 75-year-old woman with limited income to find affordable housing in Millhaven, that the senior living waitlist ran 9 to 14 months, that she had nowhere to go. Russell had said what he always said when a problem exceeded his willingness to engage with it. He said they needed to be realistic. Sandra said she's traveled constantly for work and her apartment was only 1 bedroom. She said it in the brisk, apologetic tone of someone who has rehearsed the answer. Dennis said his wife was expecting again, and the house was already crowded, and the timing was just terrible. He said he was sorry. He said it 3 times, which meant he knew it was not enough and wanted credit for knowing. They had all suggested a facility, a place designed for people in Dorothy's situation, they said, as though her situation were a category rather than a life. They had said it the way people say things when they have already decided and simply need the other person to agree. Dorothy had not agreed. She had looked at her 3 children, these people she had carried in her body and nursed through illnesses and sat up with through nightmares, and she had understood something she had been refusing to understand for several years. The gap between them was not something that could be bridged by a different choice on anyone's part. It was not new. It had been built slowly over decades, one small failure of belief at a time. She told them she had somewhere to go. They had laughed. To understand the laughter, you need to understand Millhaven. Millhaven, Georgia was the kind of small town that prided itself on knowing everything. Not the facts precisely. The facts have a way of being complicated and requiring effort to establish. What Millhaven knew was the stories, the versions that had been passed around long enough to acquire the patina of truth, the comfortable narratives that explained who people were and why they deserved what had happened to them. Dorothy Calloway was one of Millhaven's stories. The version the town knew was simple. 40 years ago, a woman named Dorothy Briggs, a seamstress with no family connections, and a certain kind of pride that some people found off-putting, had made inappropriate advances toward the pastor of Millhaven Community Church. The pastor, a married man of God, had rebuffed her firmly and reported the incident to the church elders. There had been a scene. There had been a canceled wedding. The woman had eventually married someone else quietly at the courthouse and had lived on the edges of Millhaven society ever since, serving as a cautionary tale about what happened when a woman overestimated her own appeal. That was what Millhaven knew. Dorothy's children had grown up inside that story. They had heard it in whispers at school, in the careful silences that fell when their mother's name came up at church, in the way certain women in town looked at Dorothy and then looked away. They had grown up with the particular shame of children who believe their parent might have done the thing people say, who have never quite been able to ask the question directly, who have chosen the comfortable ambiguity of not knowing over the painful clarity of finding out. Frank had known the truth. Frank had believed Dorothy from the very beginning, completely and without reservation, and he had married her anyway at the county courthouse with no family present on either side and a single witness they had found in the hallway. He had spent 30 years loving her in a town that did not respect her, and he had died of cancer 23 years ago without ever once suggesting that her version of events might be anything other than exactly accurate. But Frank was gone, and without Frank's steady, quiet certainty, as ballast, Dorothy's children had drifted back toward the town's version. Not fully, not consciously, but enough. Enough that when Dorothy needed them, they found reasons that had been there all along, reasons why they could not help. Reasons that had nothing to do with an old scandal and everything to do with it. There was something else about Russell, something Dorothy did not know yet. Russell had been 25 years old, a second-year law student, when he had first come across the name Thomas Burrick. It had appeared in a footnote in an old civil matter he was researching at the county courthouse, a minor reference to a witness statement that had never been officially filed. The statement was vague, referencing an incident at Millhaven Community Church in the spring of 1985. Russell had recognized his mother's name. He had recognized the year. He had closed the file. He had not closed it out of malice. He had closed it because he was 25 and ambitious, and because he had started dating Thomas Burrick's daughter 6 months earlier, a woman named Gail who was warm and steady and who had nothing to do with whatever her father may or may not have witnessed 4 decades ago. Russell had told himself that pursuing it would accomplish nothing, that the past was the past, that stirring up something that old would only cause pain for everyone involved. He had told himself these things with enough conviction that he had almost believed them. He had married Gail Burrick the following spring. He had built a successful practice. He had never mentioned the file to anyone, not to his wife, not to his siblings, not to his mother. He had carried it the way people carry things they do not want to examine, in the part of themselves that stays quiet as long as you do not look directly at it. Dorothy did not know any of this yet. She was still standing on the sidewalk outside the yellow house on Sycamore Street, watching strangers load the last of her belongings into a donation truck, listening to her children explain in patient and reasonable tones why they could not help her. She picked up her suitcase. She did not say goodbye. She said where she was going because they were still her children, and she was still their mother, and some habits of care do not break cleanly, even when they probably should. She told them she would be at Eleanor's old property, the land outside town where her grandmother's house had stood before the fire. She told them this knowing they would not come. She told them anyway. Russell said she was being irrational. Sandra said the place had been abandoned for 15 years. Dennis said she couldn't possibly mean to actually stay there. All three of them watched her walk away with expressions she could not see, but would have recognized if she had turned around. Relief carefully dressed up as concern. She did not turn around. The road out of Millhaven toward the old Briggs property ran southeast for 3 miles along a route that Dorothy had not traveled in decades. The town thinned gradually, the neat residential streets giving way to commercial blocks and then to the wider spaces of rural Georgia, pecan groves, and red clay fields in the particular quality of morning light in the south that makes everything look like it is either beginning or ending, never simply continuing. Dorothy walked slowly. At 75 with a suitcase and a coat, 3 miles required patience. She gave it patience. She had learned a long time ago that some things cannot be hurried without breaking. She thought about Eleanor as she walked. Eleanor Briggs, born somewhere in County Clare, Ireland in 1900, had arrived at Ellis Island in 1920 with a steamer trunk, a cameo ring that had belonged to her mother, and whatever combination of stubbornness and hope had brought her across the Atlantic at 20 years old. She had made her way south eventually to a part of Georgia that reminded her she always said of nothing in Ireland whatsoever, but had accepted her anyway. She had married a man named Cecil Briggs, built a house on a piece of land outside Millhaven, and proceeded to become one of those people whose presence in a place becomes so woven into it that later generations cannot imagine the landscape without them. Eleanor had been 75 when Dorothy was born, which meant she had been ancient for as long as Dorothy could remember, a permanent feature of the world like weather. She had smelled of lavender and strong tea, and the particular dusty sweetness of old sachets kept in drawers for too long. She had told stories in a voice that still carried traces of an accent worn smooth by 50 American years. She had believed with a conviction that did not require argument that the truth was always worth knowing, and that most people's mistakes came from choosing not to find it out. She had pressed a small brass key into Dorothy's palm when Dorothy was 25 years old. Eleanor had been 90 then, lying in the narrow bed she had occupied for the last months of her life, her grip still surprisingly strong for someone so diminished. She had said, when you have nowhere left to go, when you've lost everything that can be taken, go to the sanctuary. There is something there I have kept for you, something that will matter when you need it most. Promise me you'll remember. Dorothy had promised. She had held her grandmother's hand and thought it was the gentle confusion of a mind releasing its grip on the present, the kind of soft instruction that the very old sometimes give meaningful to them in ways that cannot quite translate forward into the living world. She had kept the key anyway. 50 years on a tarnished chain in the back of a jewelry box, moving from apartment to the yellow house on Sycamore Street, surviving 3 moves and a flood, and the clearing out of everything after Frank died. She had never thrown it away. She had not been able to explain why. Now she knew. The property emerged from the tree line the way abandoned places tend to gradually, and with a certain apology, as though embarrassed by what it had become. The driveway was invisible under 15 years of undergrowth. The foundation where the house had stood was a rectangle of cracked concrete almost entirely reclaimed by weeds and the aggressive enthusiasm of Georgia kudzu. Young trees had rooted in the gaps. Nature had been thorough, but beyond the foundation set into the hillside at the back of the property, exactly where it had always been, was the door. It was a heavy wooden door weathered to a silver gray set into a frame of mortared stone that looked as solid as the day it had been built. Cecil Briggs had constructed the root cellar sometime in the early 1940s, dug deep into the hillside to take advantage of the natural insulation of the earth, meant to keep vegetables through the summer heat and the winter cold both. Eleanor had used it for storage, yes, but she had also used it as something else, as a place that was entirely hers, where she could think without interruption, in a life that had offered very little of that. A rusted padlock hung from the latch. Oxidized to a deep orange-brown, it looked like it might crumble at a touch. Dorothy reached into her coat pocket and found the key on its tarnished chain. Her hands were not quite steady. She fitted the key into the lock. It caught, resisted ground against decades of rust. She used both hands and more force than she expected to need. The mechanism turned with a sound like something tearing, and the padlock opened. The door itself was another matter. Swollen with moisture and decades of temperature change warped in its frame, it had essentially become part of the hillside. Dorothy braced both feet against the stone foundation, gripped the iron handle with both hands, and pulled. The door shuddered. She pulled harder. Something shifted in the frame, and then with a sound like a long exhale, the door came open. The smell reached her first. Earth and old wood, and something that had been shut away too long. And beneath that faint but unmistakable, the ghost of lavender. Dorothy stood in the opening for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she turned on the small flashlight she had found at the bottom of her suitcase, one of the few practical items her children had allowed her to keep, and stepped inside. The cellar was larger than she had remembered it. Memory from childhood visits had compressed the space into something smaller, more intimate. The actual room stretched back into the hillside a good 20 feet with a curved ceiling of mortared stone and heavy timber beams that had held for 80 years and showed no signs of stopping. Stone shelves lined both walls, most empty, a few still holding mason jars coated in dust, their contents lost to time. At the very back, illuminated in the beam of her flashlight, was the trunk. It was exactly as she remembered it from the few times Eleanor had opened the cellar to show her what was inside. Dark oak bound with brass fittings that had turned the color of old pennies, built wide and deep in the way of things that were made to last and did. Eleanor's hope chest brought from Ireland in 1920, carrying everything she owned in the world across an ocean. It had been here in this room for as long as Dorothy could remember. And now kneeling in front of it in the flashlight beam, Dorothy saw that the brass fittings were still solid, the oak still sound. The chest was sealed with the red wax pressed across the join between lid and body in a thick, unbroken line. Pressed into the wax was Eleanor's cameo ring, the one she had worn on her right hand every day for 50 years, the one that had been missing from her finger when she was buried. Dorothy had wondered about that missing ring. She had wondered for 30 years. Now she understood. Eleanor had not worn the ring to her grave. She had used it here in this room as a seal and a signature and a promise. Dorothy sat for a long time in front of the trunk without opening it. She thought about Eleanor at 90, already past the age when most people's stories end, pressing that key into a 25-year-old woman's palm and trusting that it would find its way to exactly this moment. She thought about the faith that required the patience of it, the love behind it. She thought about all the years she had carried that key without understanding it, and about how it had come to mean something after all, just the way Eleanor had known it would. She broke the wax seal. The lid was heavy, but opened on hinges that were still precise, still smooth, built by someone who understood that good work should outlast the person who made it. The smell that rose from inside was stronger now, a deep, concentrated wave of lavender and cedar, and something older beneath both the particular scent of things preserved with intention. Under layers of yellowed tissue paper folded with meticulous care was a dress. Ivory silk, delicate lace applique along the bodice and the hem, a fitted waist and a skirt that would fall in soft folds to the floor. The kind of dress that could only have been made by someone who understood fabric at the level of conversation, who knew what each thread was capable of and asked only that much from it. Dorothy sat on the cold stone floor with the dress in her hands and stopped breathing. She knew this dress. She had made it herself 40 years ago in the spare bedroom of a small apartment on Clement Street, working by lamplight in the evenings after the alterations. Jobs were done, pouring everything she had into every stitch. She had made it for a wedding that had been planned for June of 1985. She had made it with the specific and almost unbearable hope of someone who has been alone for a long time and has finally found something worth hoping for. She had never worn it. The wedding had been canceled 2 weeks before it was to happen. The dress had disappeared from her apartment during the chaos of everything falling apart, and she had assumed it was lost, thrown away in the upheaval, gone along with everything else. She had not let herself think about it much after that. Some losses are too precise to examine directly, but it had not been thrown away. Eleanor had taken it. Eleanor had brought it here to this room, to this trunk, and had kept it for 40 years, preserved with tissue paper and lavender sealed behind red wax and her own cameo ring waiting. Dorothy held the dress and wept. Not quietly, in the way of someone who has been holding something back for a very long time, in the way of grief that has waited past all reasonable patience and finally takes what it is owed. She sat on the floor of her grandmother's root cellar and cried for the wedding that had been stolen from her, for 30 years of living on the edges of a town that had decided what she was, for the husband who had believed her and was gone, for 3 children who had not quite managed to, for the 75 years of a life lived with more dignity than most people would have been able to sustain under the same circumstances. She cried until she was empty of it. Then she was quiet for a while. Then she picked up the dress and looked at it more carefully. Her fingers moved across the fabric with the automatic attention of 50 years of professional habit, checking the condition, assessing the preservation, noting where the silk had held and where it had softened with age. Her hands moved to the bodice, to the lining, and stopped. The lining was wrong, not damaged, not deteriorated. Wrong in the way that only a person who had spent decades understanding the interior architecture of garments would notice. The lining was stiffer than it should have been, thicker than the original construction called for, as though something had been added beneath it. And there along the lower edge of the bodice lining was a seam that Dorothy did not recognize. A careful seam, skilled and almost invisible, but not her work. Someone else had opened this lining and closed it again. Dorothy reached into her suitcase without looking, her hands finding her small sewing scissors by touch, and made a single careful cut along the foreign seam. The lining fell open. 3 envelopes dropped into her lap. They were old envelopes, yellowed and soft with age, 3 addressed in different handwriting to Eleanor Briggs at the Millhaven post office box that Eleanor had maintained for as long as Dorothy could remember. 2 were sealed. The third, larger than the others, was addressed in handwriting. Dorothy recognized from 50 years of birthday cards and letters and the small notes Eleanor tucked into packages she sent. My beloved Dorothy. Dorothy sat in the dark of the root cellar in the light of a small flashlight, in the dress that had been waiting 40 years for her, with 3 envelopes in her hands and the cold stone of the hillside pressing in on every side. Outside, through the heavy door, the Georgia afternoon was beginning its slow descent toward evening. Birds called somewhere in the trees above. The world continued its business. Dorothy sat very still. She thought about Eleanor pressing that key into her palm 50 years ago, saying, "Go to the sanctuary when you have nothing left." She thought about it now with understanding she had not had then, could not have had then. Eleanor had not been confused. Eleanor had not been rambling. Eleanor had been preparing with the long patience of someone who understood that certain truths take decades to find their moment, who had looked at her 25-year-old granddaughter and seen not just who she was, but what might be coming, and had decided with the quiet ferocity of someone who loved a person completely to prepare for the worst while hoping for something better. The worst had come. 40 years later, it had arrived in the form of an eviction notice and 3 children who had laughed, and Eleanor had been ready. Dorothy set the flashlight on the edge of the trunk so its beam illuminated the envelopes in her hands. She thought about what she was about to read, about the weight of it, about the 40 years between whatever these letters contained and this moment in a root cellar in Georgia. She thought about Frank, who had believed her without evidence, and about what it would have meant to him to know that evidence existed. She thought about the dress in her lap, the dress she had made with her own hands for a life that had been taken from her, preserved here in the dark for exactly this moment. She set the first envelope carefully on her knee. She would read them tonight. Tomorrow was Sunday, and Sunday morning in Millhaven, Gerald Harmon would be standing in the town square with his coffee cup and his practiced smile, accepting the admiration of people who had believed his version of things for 40 years. Dorothy looked at her hands in the flashlight beam, the hands that had sewn 10,000 garments, the hands that had raised 3 children, the hands that had held Frank Calloway's hand while he died and had gone on afterward because there was no alternative to going on. 75 years of work and grief and stubborn, quiet endurance written into every line of them. She was not afraid. She was not angry, or not only angry. She was something more focused than angry, something that had been building for 40 years and had finally found its direction. She was a woman who had been told in every way possible that her version of events did not matter, that her word carried no weight against the word of a man with power and reputation. She had lived inside that verdict for 4 decades. She had accepted it because she had no choice. Now in her hand she was holding a choice. The flashlight threw her shadow long against the stone wall. Outside, the birds had gone quiet. The first stars were beginning to appear above the tree line, faint, and early, the kind that arrived before full dark like advanced scouts. Dorothy opened the first envelope. Part 2, what Eleanor kept. The first letter was written in a hand that pressed hard into the paper, the way people write when they are trying to make something permanent before they lose their nerve. It was dated August 14th, 1985, 7 weeks after the wedding that did not happen. Dear Mrs. Briggs, I am writing this letter because I cannot carry what I know in silence any longer, even though I am far too afraid to speak these words in any place where they might reach the people who need to hear them. I have written this letter 4 times. I have thrown away the previous 3. I am sending this one before I can talk myself out of it again. My name is Agnes Plimpton. I was Gerald Harmon's secretary for 11 years. I handled his correspondence, his appointments, his schedule. I knew the rhythm of his days better than most people know their own. I was in the outer office on the afternoon of May 6, 1985, the afternoon he has described to the elders as the occasion on which Dorothy Briggs came to his office and behaved improperly toward him. I made that appointment myself. Pastor Harmon asked me to contact Miss Briggs and request she come in to discuss the wedding ceremony arrangements. I thought nothing of it. I had made hundreds of such appointments. What I heard through the wall of his office was not a woman making improper advances. I heard his voice first lower than his pulpit voice, slower, with a particular quality I had heard before on other occasions, and had trained myself not to think about too carefully. I heard her respond in the clear, firm way of someone who wants no misunderstanding about what she is saying. I heard her say she was engaged to be married and that she needed to leave. I heard the shift in his voice when she said it, the way warmth can harden into something else entirely in the space of a single breath. She left quickly. I heard her footsteps across the floor and then the outer office door, and I kept my eyes on my typewriter the way I always kept my eyes on my typewriter. He came out of his office 7 minutes later. I did not look up, but I was aware of him standing in the doorway, and I was aware of his silence before he spoke. He told me to hold his calls. He went back inside. What happened next, Mrs. Briggs, is the thing I cannot put down without my hand shaking. Through that wall, over the next 40 minutes, I heard him construct the story he would tell the elders. Not in one piece, not fully formed, but in the way of someone who thinks out loud, who tries a version and revises it, who tests how things will sound before he says them in the rooms that matter. I heard him find the shape of the lie. I heard him practice the hurt in his voice. I went home that evening and I told my husband what I had heard. He told me to forget it. He told me that Gerald Harmon sat on the board of the company that employed him, that we had 3 children and a mortgage, and that I had misheard something through a wall and convinced myself it was more than it was. I told myself he was right. I told myself that for a long time. I still tell myself that on the days when I am being a coward, which is most days. I am sending you this letter because I heard through a mutual acquaintance that you are Dorothy's grandmother. I do not know what you can do with this. I do not know if it helps her at all to know that someone in this town witnessed the truth and chose to stay quiet. Perhaps it only makes things worse. But I could not go on being the only person who knows what she knows without telling someone. Dorothy Briggs is innocent. Gerald Harmon is a liar. I heard him become one. Please forgive me for not being brave enough to say this where it would count. A woman who knows what she heard. Agnes Plimpton. Dorothy set the letter down on her knee with careful hands. The cellar was very quiet. She was aware of her own breathing, of the small sounds the old timber beams made, and as the temperature outside began to drop, of the distant sound of wind moving through the trees above the hillside. She had waited 40 years to read something like this. She had waited 40 years for a single person to say what Agnes Plimpton had said in this letter, written in a shaking hand and mailed to a post office box and never mentioned again. She had imagined in the way that people imagine impossible things during the long nights of an unjust life, what it would feel like to hold actual proof. It felt less like triumph than she had expected. It felt more like grief. Grief for the 11 years Agnes had carried this, and for the 11 years Dorothy had carried the absence of it. Grief for the distance between knowing a thing and being able to say it somewhere it counts. She picked up the second envelope. The second letter was dated September 3rd, 1985. The handwriting was different from Agnes's rounder, and more deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had taken his time. Dear Mrs. Briggs, I am writing to you because I witnessed something that I believe you should know about, and because I lack the character to say it anywhere that matters. My name is Thomas Burrick. I am a businessman in Millhaven. I have known your family by reputation for many years, though we have not been personally acquainted. On an evening in early May of this year, I was walking through the parking lot of Millhaven Community Church after working late at my office downtown. It was a Thursday evening around 7:30. I was cutting through the lot as a shortcut to where I had parked on the street beyond. I saw Pastor Gerald Harmon and a woman I later identified from the town's discussions of the matter as Dorothy Briggs. She was walking toward a blue sedan near the rear of the lot, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who wants to reach her car without incident. He was behind her then, beside her, then slightly ahead of her, in the way of someone who keeps adjusting their position to remain in another person's path. I was perhaps 60 feet away. There was enough light from the lot's overhead lamps that I saw clearly. I saw him touch her arm twice each time she moved a step around him. I saw him position himself against her car door in a way that was not incidental. I saw her push his hand away from her arm with a directness that required no interpretation. I saw her finally get to her car and drive away, and I saw him stand there watching her go with an expression I could not have described to you then and cannot describe now without feeling ashamed that I saw it, and walked on. I walked on because I told myself it was none of my business. I know now what it was. I know what was happening in those weeks before the scandal broke. I know that what I saw in that parking lot was not an isolated moment, but part of something that went on for longer than it should have. And I know that when he stood in front of the elders and described himself as the wronged party, he was inverting the entire truth of what had happened, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. I should have come forward. I should have gone to the elders myself and told them what I had seen and let them weigh it against what he was telling them. I did not do this because my wife reminded me that we have significant business relationships with prominent members of that congregation, and that stepping into something like this would cost us more than we could afford to lose. I have told myself it was a practical decision. I am aware that practical and right are not the same word. I am sending this to you because I could not send it nowhere. Because the truth should exist somewhere, even if it cannot be spoken in the rooms where it would change things. I am sorry, Mrs. Briggs. I am sorry for the woman your granddaughter is, and for what is being done to her name by people who have more to protect than she does. With regret and no adequate excuse, Thomas Burrick. Dorothy read the name at the bottom of the page a second time. Then a third. Thomas Burrick. She knew that name. She had heard it in passing over the years, connected to a business on the other side of town, connected later to a family with a daughter who had married into one of Millhaven's legal circles. She had not paid much attention. There were many names in Millhaven she did not pay much attention to by long practice and conscious necessity, but she knew this name now. She turned it over in her mind, looking at it from different angles, and felt something settle into place with the particular click of a piece of information finding its context. Thomas Burrick had a daughter. She had married a lawyer. Dorothy sat very still in the beam of the flashlight. Russell had married a woman named Gail Burrick, before she became Gail Calloway. Dorothy had attended that wedding 20 years ago, had sat in a church pew and watched her oldest son marry a woman whose father sat 3 rows over on the groom's side. She had shaken Thomas Burrick's hand at the reception. She had made small talk about the weather and the flowers, and what a beautiful ceremony it had been. Thomas Burrick had looked at her across that handshake with an expression she had attributed at the time to the mild discomfort people in Millhaven often showed in Dorothy's presence, the faint social unease of someone near a person whose story they know and would rather not think about. She understood that expression differently now. He had known. He had been standing at the reception of her son's wedding, looking at the woman he had failed to defend 20 years earlier, and he had said nothing. He had shaken her hand and spoken about the weather. And Russell. Russell, who was a lawyer. Russell, who had access to county records and civil filings and the kind of historical documentation that left traces in courthouse archives for people who knew how to look. Russell, who had married into the family of a man who had witnessed the truth and committed it to paper. Dorothy thought about whether Russell knew. She thought about it for a long time, sitting in the cold of the cellar, with the letter in her hands and the flashlight casting its steady beam across the stone walls. She could not answer the question from here. She could only note it and carry it forward the way you carry a piece of weight that you are not yet ready to put down. She set the second letter beside the first on her knee and picked up the third. Eleanor's handwriting was the handwriting of Dorothy's entire childhood. The slant of it, the way certain letters connected and others stood alone, the small decorative flourish on capital letters that Eleanor had carried from a schoolroom in County Clare into her 90s. Dorothy had seen this handwriting on 50 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes tucked under the kitchen door and letters sent during the years when distance had separated them. She knew every habit of it. She knew before she read a word that this letter was going to cost her more than the other two. My dearest Dorothy, if you are reading this, then I am already gone, and whatever darkness I feared for you has found you after all. I hoped every day of the years I kept this secret that this trunk would never need to be opened. I hoped that the scandal would fade, that Gerald Harmon would be exposed by his own nature eventually, that the truth would find its way out through channels I did not have to open. I hoped for many things that did not come to pass. So I am writing to you from the other side of whatever time remains to me with everything I should have given you 40 years ago, and with an apology that I know cannot reach the size of what I owe you. When the letters came, I understood immediately what they meant. I had two witnesses. I had documentation. I had everything necessary to stand in front of those elders and dismantle what Gerald Harmon had built. I made the appointments. I prepared what I was going to say. I believed that truth presented clearly and without fear would accomplish what it is supposed to accomplish. I was not afraid of Gerald Harmon then. I was 75 years old, and I had buried a husband and survived a depression and raised children who grew up to be decent people, and I did not see what a man like that could do to me that had not already been done by harder things. I underestimated him. He came to the house on a Tuesday evening in October. I was alone. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten me in the way of someone who wants to frighten you into compliance. He was worse than that. He was calm. He sat across from me in my kitchen, and he told me, in the pleasant measured tone of someone who has thought through all the angles what would happen if I proceeded. He said he would make certain that any business Frank had in Millhaven was finished. He said he had connections with the county permitting office that he had never needed to use and would find it no burden to use them. He said that your reputation, already fragile, already reduced to almost nothing, could be reduced further, and that he had both the will and the means to do it. He said he could ensure that you and Frank could not find work within 40 miles. He said all of this quietly over a cup of coffee that I had made because I had been raised to offer hospitality and did not know yet what kind of visit this was. And Dorothy, I believed him. I believed every word of it, not because I was naive, but because I had lived in Millhaven long enough to know exactly what a man like Gerald Harmon could do in a town like Millhaven when he chose to do it. I sat with that choice for a week. I went back and forth on it every night lying in this bed with the silence of the house around me and the weight of it pressing down. I had two witnesses who had seen the truth. I had the power to stand up in front of that congregation and take apart every lie he had told. I could have done it. I was not too old, and I was not too afraid. But you were not me. You were 34 years old, and you had only just managed to build something from the wreckage of the scandal, and you had Frank who believed you and had chosen you in spite of everything, and you had possibly the beginning of a life that might not be entirely defined by what that man had done to your name. I chose to let you have that life. I chose silence as a form of protection, and I want to tell you plainly, I do not know if that was the right choice. I have gone back and forth on it for as long as I have been able to go back and forth on anything. Maybe it was cowardice dressed in the language of love. Maybe protecting you meant fighting for you regardless of what it cost. I will not know the answer to that question in this life. What I can tell you is that I did not stop. I could not go to the elders, so I did the only thing left to me. I watched him. I kept records. I am old and I am a woman, and I am no threat to Gerald Harmon in any room that counts, which means I can move through the world of this town without him watching me the way he watches people who concern him. I have used that invisibility for 8 years. Beneath the tissue paper in this trunk wrapped in the cloth that used to cover the parlor table, you will find a leather folder. Inside that folder is everything I have collected since October of 1985. Names, dates, incidents, 3 other women whose stories have the same shape as yours, two of whom left Millhaven afterward, and one of whom is still here living her life with the particular quietness of someone who has been taught that speaking up costs too much. Copies of records I should not have been able to obtain but did, because librarians and courthouse clerks, often women who understand what they are looking at even when they cannot say so officially. Notes from conversations. Dates that establish patterns. Gerald Harmon did not make a mistake with you, Dorothy. He did what he always did and what he has continued to do and what he has been permitted to do because the structures that were supposed to protect people from men like him were built by men like him and worked to his advantage at every level. That folder is not just evidence of what he did to you. It is evidence of what he is and what he has always been. Use it. I beg you to use it. I failed you by choosing quiet over justice. I loved you and I failed you. And those two things are both true at once, which is the hardest kind of truth to carry. But maybe this failure can be redeemed. Maybe something I could not do at 75, you can do at whatever age you are when you read this, armed with everything I spent the last years of my life collecting. Take back what was taken from you. I love you beyond any word I have for it. I am sorry it took this long. Your Eleanor Dorothy did not weep this time. She sat with the letter in her hands and felt the particular stillness that follows the largest revelations, the kind that do not immediately produce emotion, but instead produce a kind of rearrangement, a shift in everything you thought you understood about your own life. She had believed Eleanor was gone. She had believed that the person who had known her most completely, who had pressed that key into her hand 50 years ago with an old woman's certainty about what was coming, had taken whatever she knew into the ground with her. She had not understood that Eleanor had kept going, that an Irish woman in her 80s in a small Georgia town in the years when her body was winding down and the world was asking less and less of her, had chosen to spend her remaining energy in systematic, quiet, careful collection of the truth. Dorothy reached into the trunk and moved the tissue bumper aside. The leather folder was there exactly where Eleanor had described it, wrapped in faded blue cloth that Dorothy recognized as the parlor tablecloth from Eleanor's dining room. She unwrapped it carefully and set it open across her knees. It was thick. Perhaps 60-70 pages of material organized in Eleanor's meticulous hand, dated and cross-referenced and annotated with the precision of someone who understood that what she was building needed to be comprehensible to someone else, that it was no good if only Eleanor could navigate it. Dorothy turned the pages slowly. Names she did not know, dates going back to the late 1970s, years before her own encounter with Harmon, indicating that his pattern was older than her experience of it. A woman named Catherine Morrow, who had left Millhaven in 1979. A woman named Patricia Sundell, who had left in 1982. A woman named Louise Dre, who had stayed, whose address Eleanor had carefully noted as of the early 1990s. Notes from a conversation Eleanor had recorded in her own hand dated March 1990 with a former church administrative volunteer who had observed Harmon's behavior over several years and had been willing to describe it privately to a curious old woman over tea without understanding that the curious old woman was building a case. And at the back of the folder, a section that Eleanor had labeled simply pattern, in her firm script laying out in clear and organized language the timeline of incidents, the consistent elements, the way each situation had been managed and resolved in Harmon's favor, and what that resolution had cost the women involved. Dorothy sat in the cellar for a long time after she closed the folder. Outside, the night had come fully. The Georgia dark settled in around the old property, complete and heavy, the way darkness gets in places far from town, where there are no streetlights to argue with it. The temperature had dropped. Dorothy pulled her coat tighter and sat with Eleanor's work across her knees and thought. She thought about what she was holding. Not just letters, not just the testimony of two frightened witnesses who had committed their guilt to paper and mailed it to an old woman's post office box. She was holding 8 years of deliberate, careful, organized documentation by a woman who had understood that evidence does not build itself, that justice does not simply emerge, that someone has to do the work of making truth navigable by the people who need it. Eleanor had done that work. Alone in her 80s, in the years when most people would have considered her contribution to the world's problems complete. Dorothy thought about Gerald Harmon standing in Millhaven's town square on Sunday mornings. She had heard about those mornings for years through the occasional scraps of town news that reached her. The fellowship hours, the coffee in the community, the beloved elder statesman who had led that congregation for decades and in semi-retirement, was still its most respected figure. She thought about what it meant to stand in the center of a community's respect for 40 years wrapped in a lie. She thought about the other women, the ones Eleanor had named, the ones who had left, and the one who had stayed, and what they had each carried in the silence that Harmon's power had required of them. She thought about being 75 years old and sleeping on the floor of a root cellar because her children had laughed when she said she had nowhere else to go. She picked up the dress. It was too dark to work by eye, but Dorothy did not need her eyes for this. 50 years of seamstress work had built in her a tactile understanding of fabric and construction that was older and more reliable than vision. Her hands moved across the dress in the flashlight's beam, assessing planning, understanding what could be changed and what needed to remain. The train. She could remove the train, detach it at the seam she had put there 40 years ago, which her fingers found without searching. Without the train, the dress felt differently, less ceremonial, more substantial. She could alter the neckline, straighten what she had curved, remove the romantic excess, and leave the elegance. The lace at the bodice could stay. The silk could stay. The fundamental quality of what she had made could not be taken away from it, had survived 40 years of careful preservation, and would survive one more night of careful work. She worked through the night by flashlight. The cellar was cold, the kind of cold that settles into stone and does not move. Dorothy did not notice it in any way that changed what she was doing. She noticed the fabric under her hands, the particular resistance of old silk to the scissors, the way the lace released its attachment to the bodice seam with a reluctance that she respected. She worked slowly and precisely the way she had always worked, because precision is not a speed but a quality of attention. And quality of attention was something she had never been without the resources for, not even now. She thought about Eleanor as she worked. She thought about a young woman stepping off a boat in 1920 with a steamer trunk and a cameo ring, and enough stubbornness to cross an ocean alone and build a life in a state that looked nothing like the one she had left. She thought about what it takes to carry a truth across 40 years and still believe that it will matter when it arrives. She thought about the faith required for that, the long, patient, unrewarded faith, and she tried to feel worthy of it. Somewhere before dawn, in the stillest part of the night, Dorothy sat back and looked at what she had made. The dress was no longer a wedding gown. It was something harder to name but easier to understand. A dress that said its wearer had come to a serious occasion with the full weight of her attention. A dress that said its wearer had not arrived accidentally, had not come because she had nowhere else to be, but had chosen this moment with deliberate and prepared intention. It was the most beautiful thing she owned. It was the only beautiful thing she owned. That felt right. She laid it carefully across the top of the trunk and set Eleanor's folder beside it. She put the 3 letters back into their envelopes and placed them on top of the folder. She had 4 hours before the fellowship gathering in the town square. She did not sleep. She sat in Eleanor's root cellar in the old lavender dark and thought through everything she knew about Gerald Harmon and about the town that had sheltered him and about what needed to be said and how to say it so that it could not be dismissed or deflected or managed back into silence. She was not afraid of making a mistake. She had been living inside his mistake for 40 years. Whatever happened tomorrow could not be worse than what she had already survived. The first light came through the door in a thin gray line across the floor. Dorothy stood up from the trunk, picked up the dress, and began to put it on. Her hands were steady. Part 3, the morning she took it back. The town square of Millhaven, Georgia looked the same on Sunday mornings as it had looked for 40 years. This was not an accident. Small towns that survive long enough develop a particular investment in their own continuity, a need to prove through repetition that the things they value are permanent. The fellowship hour before service had been a Millhaven institution since before Dorothy was born. The same folding tables appeared every week, the same urns of coffee, the same arrangement of pastries from the same bakery on Clement Street. The same clusters of people formed in roughly the same configurations, the same conversations resuming where they had left off the previous Sunday, the same comfortable assumption that this week would be substantially identical to last week, and that next week would continue the pattern without interruption. Dorothy walked into the square at 9 minutes past 9. She had taken extra time on the road from the property, not because she was uncertain, but because she had wanted to arrive after the gathering had fully formed, after Harmon had settled into his usual position at the center of things, after everyone was comfortable and present and paying the relaxed, unfocused attention of people who are not expecting anything to happen. She had wanted witnesses. The more settled and numerous, the better. The dress drew eyes before anything else. Ivory silk and altered lace moving through a Sunday morning crowd with a quality of intention that people registered before they understood what they were looking at. She saw the double takes, the conversations that paused mid-sentence, the slow turning of heads. She walked through it all without altering her pace or her direction. Gerald Harmon was standing where she had known he would be standing, at the approximate center of the square's largest gathering, a white-haired man of 78, whose posture still carried the particular erectness of someone who has spent decades at a pulpit. He was holding a coffee cup in both hands and speaking to a group of perhaps 15 people who were arranged around him in the loose, attentive semicircle of an audience that does not know it is an audience. He was telling a story. She could see it in the animation of his face and the way the people around him were already leaning slightly toward the punchline. Dorothy stopped 4 feet in front of him. He looked up from the story and saw her, and the animation drained from his face so completely and so quickly that the people around him noticed the absence of it before they noticed her. For a single unguarded moment, Gerald Harmon looked at Dorothy Calloway in her ivory dress and showed her exactly what 40 years of maintained confidence actually rested on. Then the practiced face came back. He smiled. Not the storytelling smile, something more careful than that. The smile of a man who has navigated difficult moments before and trusts his ability to navigate this one. Dorothy reached into her bag. She did not raise her voice. She had learned from 5 decades of working in small rooms with women who needed alterations and wanted to talk that a quiet voice in a public space draws more attention than a loud one. Loud voices tell people the speaker is performing. A quiet voice tells them something real is happening. She said his name once, clearly without prefix, without the title that Millhaven had spent 40 years attaching to it. She said Gerald Harmon, and then she began. She told the gathering what had happened in May of 1985. Not the version the town knew, the version she had lived. She said it in the plain sequential language of someone who has had 40 years to organize their account into its most honest shape without embellishment and without apology. She described the appointment she had been asked to attend. She described what had happened inside that office. She described the parking lot on the Thursday evening, the way he had followed her to her car, the 2 times he had touched her arm, the way she had finally gotten inside and driven away with her hands not quite steady on the wheel. She described the 2 weeks that followed, the discomfort of planning a wedding with a man who had become something frightening, the calculation she had made that she could get through it, that getting to the other side of the ceremony was all that mattered, that she could manage it if she just kept refusing clearly enough. She described what it felt like to be called in front of the church elders and hear herself described as the person who had initiated everything. She described the faces of those elders listening, the way they had already decided before she said a word. Harmon let her speak for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he did what she had known he would do. He smiled at the crowd around him with the particular expression of a man dealing patiently with something unfortunate. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who has had 40 years of practice being believed. He said he had hoped she had found peace. He said it was painful to see someone still so consumed by something that had happened so long ago. He said he had always prayed for Dorothy Calloway, had continued to pray for her, and that he was sorry for whatever pain her life had held, but that her account of events was not accurate. He said it gently. He said it like he meant it. He was very good. The crowd shifted in the way that crowds shift when they are trying to determine which direction to settle. Dorothy watched it happen and did not change her expression. Then Russell was beside her. She had not seen him approach. He must have been on the far side of the gathering when she arrived and had worked his way through as she spoke. He appeared at her left shoulder in his Sunday clothes, his face arranged into an expression she recognized as his professional neutrality, the look he used when he wanted to appear measured while actually being alarmed. He spoke quietly enough that only she could hear him. He said, "Mom, please don't do this here. You're going to make it worse for yourself. Let me take you somewhere, and we can talk about this properly." Dorothy looked at her oldest son for a long moment. She thought about a courthouse archive. She thought about a young man of 25 who had found a name in a footnote and closed the file. She said quietly that she appreciated his concern. Then she turned back to the gathering and opened Eleanor's folder. Not just the 3 letters. The full folder thick with 8 years of Eleanor Briggs working alone, in the years the world was asking nothing of her, organizing everything she could find into a record that could be read by someone who had not been there. Dorothy held it up so that the assembled crowd could see its thickness, could understand from the sheer physical weight of it that this was not an accusation produced from memory, an old grievance, but something different, something built with patience and precision over a very long time. She set it open on the nearest fellowship table. She said, "This is a record my grandmother kept for 8 years beginning in October of 1985. She was prevented from bringing these materials forward at that time by a personal visit from Gerald Harmon to her home, during which he made clear what the consequences of doing so would be. She was in her mid-80s. She was alone. She made the choice to stay quiet and to spend whatever time she had left building this record instead, so that the truth would exist somewhere, even if she could not make it heard." She picked up Agnes Plimpton's letter and read from it. Not all of it. Enough. The part about the appointment she had made herself. The part about what she had heard through the office wall. The part about the 40 minutes of practiced revision. She read it in the same quiet, clear voice she had been using, and she watched the faces around her change as she read. She picked up Thomas Burrick's letter and read from it. The parking lot, the 2 touches on the arm, the car door blocked, the drive away that had required a push. She read the final paragraph, the one about practical decisions and the difference between practical and right, and when she reached the name signed at the bottom, she paused. She said, "Thomas Berwick was a businessman in Millhaven. Some of you knew him. His daughter Gail is married to my son Russell, who is standing beside me." The square went very quiet. She looked at Russell. He had gone the color of old concrete. He was looking at the letter in her hands with the expression of someone watching a door open that they spent 20 years hoping would stay closed. She said to the gathering, not to Russell, "Not yet. I do not know precisely what my son knew or when he knew it. I know that he had access to information that might have led him to this letter if he had looked for it, and I know that he did not look. I am not telling you this to humiliate him. I am telling you because the way this truth was kept quiet for 40 years was not through one large act of concealment. It was through many small individual choices made by people who had reasons to look the other way. And those choices accumulated into 40 years of a false record that an entire town believed because it was easier to believe than to question." Harmon had been silent for longer than she had expected. She turned to face him directly. He was still standing where he had been, but the posture had changed. The erectness was gone. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands in a way that had stopped looking casual and started looking like he needed something to hold on to. The crowd around him had rearranged itself in the subtle but significant way of people who are no longer arrayed as an audience for him but as witnesses to something else entirely. She said, "There are names in this folder of women whose experiences preceded mine and followed mine. Women who left this town and women who stayed. What was done to me was not a mistake or a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment by an otherwise good man. It was a pattern. It was practiced. It was protected by exactly the kind of community trust that you are all still extending to him this morning." She picked up the folder and held it out toward him. She said, "I would like you to tell these people who have known you and trusted you for decades what your response is to the names in this record. Not to me, to them." Gerald Harmon looked at the folder. He looked at it for a long time. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer, dense and self-incriminating in a way that no words could have been. Dorothy watched him calculate. She had seen that calculation before the rapid interior audit of what could still be salvaged, the assessment of how much of the structure was still standing and whether it could be reinforced. She watched him look at the faces around him, the faces of people who had been rearranged by what she had read, who were waiting now rather than assuming, who had shifted from the stance of a community gathered around its center to the stance of people who are reconsidering what the center is. He said, "I have made mistakes." His voice had changed. The authority had gone out of it, not all at once, but in the way of something structural, failing unevenly. He said, "There are things from a long time ago that I have handled badly." Dorothy said, "I am asking you a specific question. Did you lie to the church elders in June of 1985 about what happened between us?" The question was simple. Simple questions are the hardest to escape because complexity is where evasion lives, and there was nowhere in the question for complexity to shelter. Harmon said, "I was trying to protect my family." Dorothy said, "That is not what I asked." The crowd had gone absolutely still. The fellowship hour noise that had been the background texture of every Sunday morning for 40 years, the coffee cups in the conversations, in the comfortable hum of a community at ease with itself, had stopped. Every person in the square was watching Gerald Harmon try to find a way to answer a question that did not have a safe answer. He closed his eyes. He said yes, then louder because the word had come out too small for the space yes. I lied. I told them you had come to me when the truth was that I had gone to you. I told them you had behaved improperly when the truth was that you told me no clearly more than once and I was angry about it, and I used what I had to make sure that anger had somewhere to land that was not me. He stopped. He opened his eyes and looked at Dorothy with the expression of someone who has just set down something very heavy and is not sure yet if they feel better or worse for having let it go. He said, I have lived with that for 40 years. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel the release she had sometimes imagined this moment might bring. She felt something quieter and more complicated than either of those things, the particular feeling of a truth arriving after so long that its arrival cannot undo the length of the absence. She said, I know. I have lived with it longer. Then she picked up the folder from the table and turned away from Gerald Harmon and walked toward the edge of the gathering. Russell reached her before she had gone 10 feet. She stopped and waited while he gathered himself. He was 50 years old, and he was crying in the way that men who rarely cry do it badly, and without preparation, his face doing things it did not know how to do. He said, Mom. She waited. He said, the file in the courthouse. I found it when I was in law school. Thomas Burke's name, the reference to the incident, everything pointing at what I could have found if I had followed it. I knew what it might mean. I knew who Thomas Burke was to me by then, and I told myself it was too old, too uncertain, that digging it up would only cause pain. I told myself all the things you tell yourself when you want to not do something that you know you should do. He stopped. He said, I knew, Mom. Not everything, but enough to have looked further, and I chose not to. Dorothy looked at her oldest son, the boy she had carried and nursed and watched become a man in a town that had not been kind to his mother, who had built a life in the careful space between believing her and not believing her, who had chosen the comfortable ambiguity because the alternative cost too much. She said, I know you did. He said, can you forgive me? She said, I don't know yet. That's the most honest answer I have. She said, what I know is that forgiveness is not the same as pretending. I can choose to let go of the anger eventually if I decide that carrying it is costing me more than releasing it. But I cannot pretend that 20 years of marriage into the family of a man who watched what happened to me and said nothing and never once thought to look at that file again as a small thing. It is not a small thing, Russell. It is the particular shape that 40 years of choosing not to know has taken in my life. She said, if you want to earn something from me, earn it over time, with decisions that are harder than the ones you have been making. I will be paying attention. She left him standing there and walked through the crowd, which opened for her the way crowds open for people who have just changed the shape of a room. The afternoon happened in the way of afternoons that arrive after mornings that have altered everything. Someone had filmed it. Of course someone had filmed it. By Sunday evening, the video existed in the way that things exist now, when they have been seen by enough people simultaneously everywhere, carrying Dorothy's quiet voice and the folder open on the fellowship table and the long silence before Harmon's yes across screens in states she had never visited and would never visit. By Monday morning, news vans had found their way to Eleanor's old property, and Dorothy had stood at the door of the root cellar in the morning light and spoken clearly and without drama about 40 years of a false record and an 8-year investigation conducted by an Irish woman in her 80s who had understood that the truth needed a keeper if it was going to survive long enough to be useful. The foundation Harmon chaired met in emergency session Monday afternoon. He resigned before the meeting concluded. The church issued a formal statement by Tuesday long and carefully worded in the way of institutions managing what they cannot undo, but containing in its careful language a clear and public acknowledgement that Dorothy Calloway had been wrongly accused in 1985, that the church had failed in its responsibility to her, and that the record of that failure deserved to be stated plainly. Louise Dray called on Tuesday evening, one of the names in Eleanor's folder. She had lived in Millhaven for 40 years with the particular quietness of someone who has been taught that speaking costs too much. She did not say much on the phone. She said, I saw the video. I wanted you to know that you are not the only one. I think I knew that you knew that already, but I wanted to say it out loud to someone. Dorothy said, I know. Eleanor knew. She wrote your name down. There was a long silence on the line. Louise said she was something, wasn't she? Dorothy said she was everything. A lawyer reached her Wednesday. Pro bono, he said, because the case had moved him, because the documentation was extraordinary, because Eleanor Briggs's 8-year record represented a level of evidentiary preparation that most attorneys spent entire careers hoping to encounter and rarely did. He said this is not a difficult case. He said Gerald Harmon is not going to fight this. He was right. Harmon did not fight it. The settlement was reached in 6 weeks in the measured businesslike language of civil resolution, and the amount, while not spectacular, was specific enough to change the material facts of Dorothy's life. It was enough for a house, a small one on the eastern edge of Millhaven, with 2 bedrooms and a garden space that received good light in the morning, and a room at the back with windows on 3 sides where a person could set up a work table and do alterations in natural light. Dorothy bought it outright. She moved in on a Tuesday in October carrying her single suitcase and Eleanor's leather folder and the dress in its archival wrapping. The house smelled of fresh paint and the particular neutrality of a space that has not yet been lived in, that is waiting to take on the character of whoever is going to occupy it. Dorothy walked through the room slowly, the way you walk through a space you are learning, noting the light and the dimensions and the way sound moved between the walls. In the room at the back, she unpacked her sewing scissors and her thread case and her measuring tape and set them on the work table. She ran her hands across the surface of the table and thought about the dining room table in the yellow house, where she had taken in alterations for 23 years, and about all the tables before that, and about the particular continuity of work that has been the steadiest thing in her life, steadier than geography or circumstance or the reliability of other people. She took the dress out of its wrapping. She had already arranged for the archival framing, a local shop whose proprietor had handled the details with the respectful care of someone who understood that the object in question was not primarily a garment. The frame was simple, dark wood, wide enough to hold the dress fully extended with UV protective glass that would preserve the silk against further aging. Dorothy hung it on the wall of the front room, where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they walked through the door. She stood back and looked at it for a long time. 40 years ago, she had made this dress in a spare bedroom on Clement Street, working by lamplight, putting everything she had into every stitch. She had been 34 years old and engaged to a man who looked at her with uncomplicated warmth and believed what she told him and had never required her to be anything other than what she was. She had made the dress with the hope of someone who has been given late and unexpectedly the thing she had stopped believing was available to her. That hope had been destroyed before the dress was worn. The dress had disappeared. She had spent 40 years assuming it was gone along with the rest of what that summer had taken. Eleanor had understood that some things should not be allowed to disappear entirely, that certain objects carry weight beyond their material existence, that a dress made by hand with specific hope is not the same as a dress bought from a rack, and that preserving it was a way of preserving the truth that Gerald Harmon had spent 40 years trying to make the town forget. The dress on the wall was evidence, not the legal kind, not the kind that goes into folders and gets presented to elders and lawyers. The other kind, the kind that says a woman existed here, that she made something with her own hands, that what was done to her name did not erase what she had been before it was done, and that the life she was owed was not canceled by a lie only deferred. Deferred, as it turned out, by 40 years. 3 weeks after she moved in, Sandra and Dennis came to the door together on a Saturday morning. Not Russell. Not yet. Dorothy noted the absence without judgment. Russell was working through something that required more time than 3 weeks, and she was willing to give him time because she understood the weight of what he was carrying, and because being willing to give people the time they need was, she had decided, one of the things she chose to be. Sandra and Dennis sat in the front room with their coffee cups and looked at the dress on the wall for a while before anyone said much. Dennis's daughter Lily, 7 years old, sat between her parents and looked at everything in the room with the systematic curiosity of a child who finds new spaces interesting. The conversation with Sandra and Dennis was not the conversation Dorothy would have written if she had been writing it. It was not a clean accounting or a satisfying resolution. It was a longer, more complicated thing, full of the false starts and backtracking, and moments of honesty followed immediately by retreat that characterize conversations between people who have genuine grievances and genuine love for each other, and have not yet found the language for holding both at once. Dorothy said what she needed to say. She said it clearly and without cruelty, and without softening it into something that could be misunderstood. She said the way you treated me in those weeks before the eviction, the laughter and the relief and the assumption that I was defeated, will not be forgotten by me because that is not how things work. I can choose to move forward. I am choosing to move forward, but I am not choosing to pretend. She said what I want from you is not rescue and not guilt money and not the performance of being better children because the internet is watching. I want overtime, the ordinary things that should have been there all along. I want you to call and to come. I want you to believe me when I tell you things. I want you to understand that I am a person whose word is worth something, which is what I have been trying to tell this town for 40 years and what you have had available to you all along. They stayed for 2 hours. It was a beginning of something which is the most that beginnings can be. After Sandra and Dennis left, Lily stayed. She had asked with the directness of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to approach requests indirectly if she could see how the dress was made. She had been looking at it for 2 hours and she had questions. Dorothy looked at her great niece and found in the child's face the uncomplicated interest of someone who wants to understand how things work, and felt something ease in her chest. She brought out a piece of practice fabric and her needle case and sat beside Lily at the work table by the window, where the morning light came in clean and even. She showed Lily how to thread a needle, how to pull the thread through twice to make it secure, how to place the first stitch. Lily's small hands moved with the careful, exaggerated attention of someone learning a skill the first time, aware of their own uncertainty in a way that they would not be aware of much later when the hands knew what to do without being told. Dorothy watched those small hands and thought about her own hands at 7 years old, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table in the house that was now a charred foundation under 40 years of Georgia kudzu learning, for the first time, how a needle moves through fabric and how a stitch holds two pieces of material together in a bond that is stronger than either piece alone. Lily asked about the dress on the wall. Dorothy looked at it for a moment. Then she began to talk. She told Lily about the woman who had made the dress and the summer that it was made for, and the man who had lied and the town that had believed him. She told her about Eleanor, about the root cellar and the leather folder and the 8 years of careful, quiet, unrewarded work. She did not simplify it past the point of truth. Lily was 7 years old and she was listening with the complete attention of a child who understands that she is being told something real. She told her about the key on the tarnished chain that had waited 50 years to be used, and about how trust extended across that kind of distance and that kind of time is the most serious thing one person can offer another. She told her that Eleanor had not left behind money or property or anything that could be measured by the standards the world usually uses to measure what a person leaves behind. She said your great-great-grandmother left behind the truth. She kept it safe for 40 years because she understood something that I want you to always remember. The truth does not expire. You can bury it and seal it behind wax and lock the door and walk away from the property, and the truth will wait. It will wait as long as it has to. It waited for me. Lily asked, and then what happened? Dorothy smiled. She said, and then someone finally came to open the door. Outside the window, the October light moved across the garden in the long, unhurried way of morning light in the south, reaching the far fence and beginning its slow transit across the dry grass, touching everything it crossed without hurrying, without having anywhere else to be. Inside, in the front room, the ivory dress hung on the wall in its frame, unmoved, unhurried, holding its 40 years of waiting like a thing that had always known this room was coming. Dorothy threaded a new needle and handed it to Lily. She said, now, show me what you remember. And the lesson continued.